Welcome back to the Bitcoin Layer. I'm Nick Bhatia. Today, we are honored to have Rusty Russell. He is building Lightning Network at Blockstream. Rusty, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Nick. I'm delighted to be here.
Rusty, talk to us about Lightning Network as a layered money concept. We want to know your take on Layered Money, my book, and how does the layered money framework hold up for Bitcoin and Lightning Network? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting. So when I was reading through Layered Money, and towards the end, you talk about Bitcoin and the layers there. You have a diagram suggesting that the Lightning Network is really kind of a second layer on top of Bitcoin as a base layer of money. And my original reaction was, well, not really. You're kind of like, well, it's pretty much it is Bitcoin. Right? Is there a separate layer? And then when I thought about it more, I thought, actually, Nick, I think you're right. And I kind of went around a little bit in the weeds here, but to some extent, at best, right, in the ideal world, you're literally holding a Bitcoin transaction. You're ready to spend it. It is so close. It is almost frictionless to get to that. That upper layer. But I think that's true of any layered money, right? I mean, whether it's a mechanical mechanism or whether, it's a friendly person down at the bank that will give you your gold back when you ask for it, really doesn't make a difference at the point of view of layering. But it's particularly interesting because there are cases where that layering affects you. For example, on Lightning, with every various scheme that we know of, there is some requirement for vigilance, right? You talk in your book about how when there's a panic of some kind, everyone tries to get to the higher layer, right? They're trying to get back to a base layer money. And that's true of Lightning as well, right? Because there is that, requirement for vigilance. Now, it may be mechanical in this case. You don't have to literally check outside, is there blood in the streets? Do I need to, worry about my bank redemptions? But just from a mechanical point of view, you do have to check on chain occasionally whether the other side is attempting to use, some revoked mechanism, and you have to basically go and spend and go basically up to base money layer again. So when I thought about it, I said, actually, no, it is very fair. It does have those qualities. The fact that it's mechanical rather than an actual custodian involved is really a detail and perhaps a quality issue, but it's definitely a layer. But the other point is that it really is a layer when you talk about the edge cases, like de minimis amounts. Your tiny amounts on Lightning are basically kind of a sort of a little bit of a trust mechanism between the two parties. I mean, your counterparty can't steal it, but you can't really immediately convert it to base money, right? Because there's some friction there. So I did come away with going, actually, no, Nick is right in this case. There is definitely a layer here, and certainly a provision for other layers then on top of this.
And it's very interesting that you use the word vigilance to describe this, because when we think about traditional layered money, or in the way that I wrote about it, the delineation between layers exists due to balance sheets, or at least that's where it comes from originally. It's an asset versus a liability. In Lightning Network, it's not an asset liability relationship. It has to do with payment channels, smart contracts, time locks, and vigilance, as you suggest. So it's a unique, as Bitcoin is, incredibly unique. And this sort of layered situation in Bitcoin and Lightning Network is qualitatively very different than a balance sheet hierarchy.
Absolutely. And I think that's what tripped me up originally. I went, well, it's very different. But, the more you think about it, the model is very similar, although it is this entirely mechanical vigilance. You can say, cool, I know I only have to check every 2 weeks or every month, right? There must be some automated check here. But the other thing that I find interesting is that, when we look at like a traditional layering, like a custodian that's holding something and giving me IOUs that I can then ideally exchange, we can slip between those layers quite in interesting ways. There's a proposal that you're probably familiar with called Op Vault, where you can basically put constraints on your Bitcoin on layers, on the base layer, to say, it can only be spent in this way. There must be a delay. And if there's some key compromise or something, I can push this off to basically to a different address. The idea being that, I have my keys, but if they get compromised in some way, I can force the funds to go to a certain place. Now that becomes interesting because if that certain place, for example, were Coinbase or something, you would be able to force it into a second, upper layer if necessary. So if somebody does compromise, your funds, you would basically go, cool, okay, well then I'm going to go for a kind of a higher layer of money by pushing it to a custodian and then going to the custodian and going, hey, I now wish to redeem my funds again. And so programmatically and mechanically, we would be able to do this kind of moving between layers in a way that I found like quite enlightening using your framework as to exactly what we're doing there. So there is also that very traditional layering effect, but with this technological thing, as you say, that is novel. I mean, you can't imagine. The only thing I could think of was basically, you stamp your gold with, if found, please return to Bank of England, kind of thing, where you would hope that it would then become a credit if something went wrong, but in a way, in this case, that's quite enforceable. So I definitely find the one thing I really liked about your book is that this cogent thinking provides us with a really useful model for how we think about the different things that obviously. And I think, your at least implied thesis here is that, there absolutely will be layers and there are always layers. And it doesn't really matter how good your base layer is. There will be reasons to have, I think, other layers. And part of the exploration in Bitcoin is going to be how these layers deal with each other. And they can do so in technological ways that haven't necessarily been possible before with physical kind of money.
The Bitcoin layer is sponsored by River. Make sure to check out river.com today or the link below in the description. River is our preferred place to purchase Bitcoin. Now, when you're buying Bitcoin, guys, there are several considerations. Number one, should I be using an exchange? Is the exchange custodying their own Bitcoin? Is the exchange using platforms to custody that we don't know? Is the exchange leveraging its Bitcoin for other purposes? Well, with River, we know that River does not use leverage of any kind. River also uses its own multi-sig solution so that your Bitcoin are not held by anybody else. So it's a very important thing to understand about what River offers. Now, River also has Lightning Network integration and a lot of other really exciting features. Go check out river.com today. Absolutely. Now, for the audience that might not be familiar, Rusty is one of the world's experts on the Lightning Network. He's building Lightning Network products for Blockstream. Now, so we're going to ask Rusty about his thoughts on Lightning Network roadmap and maybe some of the problems and things that he's optimistic about. But before we do that, I want to tell people how you got here. Your background is in open source development. You've worked with Linux for in the past. And so talk to us about why open source. It seems, Rusty, like your life is dedicated to open source development. Why? Why is this so important to you? What is it about it? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk to people, the classic, like, well, how did you get into Bitcoin question? And for a lot of people from the economic side, maybe they grew up in Argentina under hyperinflation, or maybe they were always a gold bug, or maybe they're Austrian economic background, or, and you can see how they eased into kind of the Bitcoin story. Well, I come from the other side. I went through, computer science, studying various things, including operating systems. And, it was the early 90s, and I knew, the way you built an operating system, which is an important piece of, a fundamental piece of code that is required to make your hardware work. It was, you join a large corporation, they would, produce software, and eventually they would ship it out to people. And, that was the way the world works. That was the ground truth of how software was produced. And I came across Linux and kind of went down the rabbit hole a little bit, and was just amazed that people were producing this software that was competitive, and in some cases superior to the stuff being produced in the traditional manner, in completely open, like a bunch of randos on the internet producing something that was phenomenal. And it really turned my world upside down to think that actually this story of how software is produced is not necessarily the truth. And I kind of went, wow, well, I want to work with these people, right? This is where I want to be, because this was my career and very much my hobby and my interest. And so when you look at something like Bitcoin, where people are like, well, that's not how you make money, right? That's just not how money works, right? That same visceral reaction to say, well, that's not going to work. I think prepared me in a technological sense to be, okay, well, I can be a little bit contrarian here, because I've seen this story before of something where everyone said, well, that's not how things are done. And then it, slowly takes over the world. The counterpoint to that, of course, is that it took a good 25 years, right, before we could really say that we had succeeded. And that's software, which, while important, certainly important to people in the industry, right, is a much smaller problem than, say, the problem of money, right, which touches everything in a way that even software doesn't. So, I think coming in that direction, I see Bitcoin perhaps a little bit differently, but it definitely primed me for this idea that something radically different that you would immediately dismiss as not how things have ever been done was still possible.
And when we were together in Australia, what struck me is your thesis here that Bitcoin is going to take multiple decades to judge. We're way shy of that. Lightning Network is even younger than Bitcoin. So tell us, how many years will it take for you to judge Bitcoin as a success, and just zoom out for people that might be saying, hey, it's already above $1 trillion in market cap. How can you not call it a success yet? But, break down the nuance for us.
That is a good question. And I think, people use the market cap because it's an easy number. But there are more interesting, perhaps, numbers that are unfortunately harder to measure that we don't reach for. I think, the number of people who's at some point you have a number of people who are relying on this as their base currency, right? What's that number? And when that number is a significant fraction of the world, we can say, okay, we have definitely had an impact. I think when you look at changes in behavior, so when I look at like the Linux story, Linux is an operating system and everything else, but it also became a model for how software should be produced, and it affected the rest of the industry directly or indirectly, because everyone else went, in order to compete with that kind of thing, people's expectations changed for what software was, right? When David Chaum invented DigiCash and did that work in the 90s, he did it as a proprietary product, and because that was the norm, that was the expectation. Satoshi Nakamoto, 2008, of course, released it as open source because, again, that was the expectation, right? Whereas 15 years before, Satoshi Nakamoto might have created a startup and had a proprietary technology that would ship, because that the fact that wasn't even a consideration by 2008. Of course, it was going to be open source. Of course, everyone was going to be able to look at it and develop it. It's hard if you didn't live through that shift, that change, to really understand what a radical idea that was. And it's derived from projects which were successful and won in the marketplace that set that social expectation. So when we look at how do we look at the timeline for how do we judge Bitcoin? I think, to some extent, I always said with Linux, like, I don't care if other people use it, but on the other hand, no person is an island, right? You cannot, if I'm the only person using it, I've got to do all the support. I've got to make it work with all the new hardware, all that stuff. So, okay, even if you're completely egocentric, like, it's good for me, I don't care about anyone else, you still require the ecosystem, right? And Bitcoin, of course, is both directly required an ecosystem, but also there are similar things. We now have hardware wallets, right? There's a whole industry there just to help you look after your Bitcoin in a way that makes things much simpler. And then, of course, financial services and everything else. These, if nothing else, these take time to be built out. The market has to test different things, discard them. We figure out new things. So there's just a certain amount of time before we can get to any kind of maturity. And I think we're not there yet. We're definitely headed in the right direction, The vector's correct, but hey, trying to predict at what point we'll have made it is, I don't know. Perhaps in retrospect there'll be certain things, but you know, I have a 15-year-old daughter, so she's almost the same age as Bitcoin, and I don't let her drive yet, right? So I think people need to shift. There's the old joke that science proceeds one funeral at a time, and I think that people who grew up with Bitcoin and consider it to be, of course, it's always been there, have a very different breed than those of us who kind of went through the transition and went, oh, okay, so there was a time before Bitcoin. Bitcoin's still this kind of new weird thing, which is unusual, and I think that'll be inverted for generations. And so, for that reason alone, like there's a human lifetime kind of measuring stick that I think you have to use things that are genuinely radically different. I think it does it's a generational change. So hence 25 years is a reasonable benchmark, I think, to say whether we've succeeded or not.
Wonderful. And so does Bitcoin need Lightning Network to succeed fully? Like, how do you view the importance of Lightning in the grand scheme of things? Obviously, it's what you're working on with Blockstream. So what is because Lightning Network, of course, has energized people like you and like me to work on it because we find it exciting and promising. But how dependent is Bitcoin on Lightning longer term to you?
Wow, that's a really, really good question. So my interest was always in the whole. So I guess the engineering approach, right, is to look at problems and figure out how to fix them before they become worse, right? So the first thing that happens when you read the Nakamoto paper is you go, okay, well, this doesn't scale. You go, okay, this is, not everyone can watch everyone else pay for coffee in the world. I mean, the fact that we can even consider such a system just shows how amazing our computing power has become. That we can have the system where everyone validates everyone else's transactions. That's great. But there are still limits to that. And so then you immediately think, well, what can we do on top of this? And I think it's interesting because the design was left open. The original design of Bitcoin has this whole programming language inside it so that you can have programmable money. And just from an engineering point of view, I would not have done that. You can tell I'm not Satoshi because I definitely would not. I would have gone, look, making payments to people is an absolutely powerful thing. And the idea of making them programmable payments was a stretch too far. Like I just wouldn't have the imagination. Look, just from an engineering point of view, there's enough to write here without having to go one step further and go, we're going to have the ability to have programmable money. But it's what enables this mechanical layering, right? Otherwise, we could have custodians, of course, to do layering, but this mechanical layering, like the Lightning Network and building other things on top, is because of that programmable base. And that is an insight I'm not sure I would have been capable of in coming up with Bitcoin. So I do think it is important because of the fundamental scaling limits. Now, would Bitcoin succeed without it? I think yes, but the early visions for that were very much like an interbank settlement network. At the extremes, it would become, large amounts get transferred across, and there would be some layer above that would allow us to do this. Now, okay. So I guess you could argue that will exist. I mean, obviously your thesis layered money is, that stuff always exists. There will be a layer. Does the quality of the second layer affect the desirability of the first layer? I think it does. The fact that we can create a second layer that doesn't have an intermediary involved, that has this very transparent mechanical trust model. So you can be on Lightning and you know exactly under what conditions you can convert back to base layer money, makes the base layer money more attractive. I think the base layer money is attractive in itself for various other economic reasons and everything else. But I think this definitely does accelerate accelerate adoption because it is more useful.
And that's the key. And that we would agree with that wholeheartedly, that 21 million coins and proof of work mining to secure the blockchain is more important than Lightning Network. Nobody's really arguing that here. But Lightning can act as an accelerant for this money to be adopted by more than just the interbank market, like you're describing. So,
Yes.
Rusty, talk to us then about Lightning Network today and how you see the usage of it. So one metric, maybe you can talk if this metric is even relevant, is that the in publicly viewable Lightning Network nodes, we can observe basically a handful of thousand of Bitcoin. So an amount that's, let's just call it $250 million, a minuscule fraction of Bitcoin that's quote unquote locked in to the Lightning Network. Is this a fair metric to judge Lightning's success or not at all? How are you looking at Lightning today and its usage and whether it's been successful in its infant years?
Yes, so this is a really good question. In fact, there are a couple of things that make that metric both misleading and interesting. One is it's an easy metric to reach for, right? How much can we see is definitely in the Lightning Network, and of course there's the whole bottom of the iceberg, which is things that are not published that are also in the Lightning Network, and we can do some heuristic guesses on that. That is definitely seeing its own growth. Then we can kind of intuit how big that is, but to some extent, right, that is measuring the waste product of the Lightning Network, right? If the Lightning Network becomes more efficient and better at using existing funds, that number goes down, not up, right? In an ideal Lightning Network, you're shuffling funds back and forth, and you don't actually need that much Bitcoin to do, a lot of little payments. And there's two things here that are happening here. One is that because the technology now exists for you to do really, really small de minimis payments, people, of course, are doing it, right? So you're finding new markets, new businesses, new opportunities to pay small amounts. And of course, the podcasting 2.0 stuff is classic here. Like the fact that Visa and MasterCard consider a micropayment anything less than $10, right? We consider a micropayment to be something in sats where you really, you're sending tiny de minimis amounts, and we've never been able to do that. So if you had a business that required that, you couldn't exist previously. So there's a whole greenfield here of genuine micropayments that and that can grow without really requiring a huge number of Bitcoin, because it's about sheer volume of tiny payments, and the total adds up to millions at most. So we could imagine a successful Lightning Network that has a very tiny amount of capital in it, but is providing that function. Now, naturally, there's some vague correlation, right? If it becomes really, really big, by definition, that capital requirement will grow, and we can see that. But it's interesting when large nodes like River actually reduce their capital allocation because they've gotten more efficient with operations. It causes this blip in that observable number. And you go, wow, it's gone down. The Lightning Network's failing. But actually, that's a refinement and success. So in a broad trend, we can say obviously, wider adoption will lead to that number going up. But you can't obsess about that number because it also goes down when we get better at things. That said, we're also seeing perhaps the more interesting number is how much can you successfully send through the Lightning Network? What does your failure rate look like? Because there are capacity requirements on the Lightning Network. It is a different model. You get instant settlement, or instant in the fractions of a second settlement, but there requires you require a path from you to the recipient that has the fund availability in a way that Bitcoin doesn't. And also, this leads to a charging model, which is a proportional charging model, whereas there's very much the base layer has like a courier model, like how much do I have to carry, and that's its base. I think of it as if you tell a courier here's $1 million to send. If it's a few notes, it's not going to cost you very much. But if you do it in pennies, it's going to cost you possibly more than the $1 million, right? So that's the base layer charging model. Whereas the Lightning is very much a straight proportional model. There's no UTXOs and coins and things like that. So at some point, there's a natural crossover there where you go, well, of course you'd use on-chain for this because the proportional fees are going to hit you pretty hard. So the question of where that number is an interesting metric because that defines the scope of what the Lightning Network can do. Where does it hit a ceiling there? And we have to go on-chain. And that number seems to be going up. Your success rate, your sort of 95% success rate, which I would consider the minimum, is creeping up. Originally, we thought of like $10 payments and things like that. Now people routinely do like $500 kind of payments over the Lightning Network without really thinking about it. So I think that metric, which again is harder to measure, is a more useful metric for how mature the Lightning Network is.
Sure, I've noticed that in the $500 to $800 range, then the failures start to occasionally occur, and I understand, of course, that it requires the right wallet, it requires the right node on each side in order to successfully engage in that payment, because it is dependent on payment channels and the capacity there. But it's a very interesting way to propose it, Rusty. This is why we're lucky to have you on for these insights of this courier model versus the proportional model. And what Rusty's talking about is that if you need to send $1 billion worth of Bitcoin, but the data itself has been well managed in terms of the UTXOs, is specifically what I'm referring to here, you can get that transaction in the blockchain for the market rate, which might be $2, $10, and get it in the first block, and within 10 to 15 minutes have a confirmed $1 billion transaction. But in the Lightning Network, you need node capacity, so you're going to pay proportionally for that. And so there is a break-even point between on-chain and Lightning Network that Rusty's talking about. And what is that number? Nobody actually knows, but that is a fascinating study. And I'm thinking that we need the market to come up with this actual dollar figure / Satoshi figure to tell us what that break-even point, as a signal to the market itself. Hey, this is when you should be using on-chain, and this is when you should be using Lightning. People don't even know that. We don't have that number out there. There's no dashboard that tells us that. So maybe, Rusty, you can help us build that.
Yeah, and I think, well, you say people don't know that. I think to some extent people do, but in a very, very manual way at the moment. They go, "Oh, cool, I'll pay on chain." They go, "Well, that fee was ridiculous." Okay, is there an easier way for me to pay? It's automating and smoothing it would definitely be and providing that number to the market, I think, would definitely be a service and something that we're going to see. The question is, I mean, as you point out, the infrastructure requirements to basically make that payment a success. If that number is above $1,000, then it's kind of a theoretical threshold at this point, because if you can't literally pay that on the Lightning Network, in many cases, it's a different trade-off. You hit the ceiling before that. But yes, assuming that the crossover point is within the capabilities of the Lightning Network infrastructure, then it is kind of an interesting number and will vary. But of course, those numbers are correlated too. If fees are high, it's expensive for people to open and manage their channels, so they will end up passing that on. Although there are probably some arbitrage opportunities in the corners, right? While on-chain fee volatility may be high, I would expect it in the Lightning Network to be lower because you're basically paying for already established infrastructure at some point. There will be some interesting games going on, I think, between those two, right? As these systems become more automated and more clever about what they do. And also, frankly, there are some cases where if you're spending $1 billion, you can probably wait for a good cup of coffee and have your 15-minute delay. But there are other cases where people would perhaps the point will not be the mechanical point between the two, because the amount they will pay for instant settlement is higher, perhaps. Now, in the current Lightning Network, of course, in an immature market, we are seeing there's a huge number of hobbyists. There are people like me who just run nodes for experimental reasons. I charge a fee so I can test the fee code, not because I'm making any bank on it. So as we see a maturation of the market, we will see fees become real. I feel to some extent we can't extrapolate too much from what's there today, because it is much more of a kind of a hobbyist market. it's also possible that fees will always have some of that because there is a utility in running a node. And why wouldn't you route for de minimis amounts for other people? Because it does have some benefit for you, particularly in the case where you can direct those flows to to manage your own channels. You're like, well, maybe your fee is always going to be small. But I just suspect that we will end up with that kind of, as we see the professionalization of infrastructure, which it will inevitably happen at scale, we will see numbers reflecting much more the utility and the risk profile. Obviously, when you've got funds in cold storage, the active management you have to do for that is basically zero. But when you've got a Lightning node and you've got infrastructure that's looking after hot funds, hopefully your security requirement is somewhat higher, and those expenses must be passed on at some point. So, yeah, I think it's interesting. It's probably a bit early to make predictions on what fees will end up in.
Do you find fee accrual and calculating an interest rate based off of that and the capital and the time? Do you find that interesting?
I find that fascinating, and I think that will be a new. I think we're not there yet, right? I mean, we're just not in the professionalization phase. But once we get to that maturity, that number may well be something that people watch quite carefully because it is a real signal that I think is potentially very useful. There was certainly an early phase where people were like, oh, I'll set up Lightning node, basically get yield on my Bitcoin. And I'm like, oh, that's a very risky way to get, I mean, you're dealing with some fairly early software in those days. And, I'm not entirely convinced that the user base is there to support it. But certainly look, if you all want to compete to provide the best Lightning service to me, I'm not going to discourage you too wildly in that gold rush, because obviously it creates infrastructure that's great for everyone.
Yes, when I first wrote about that concept, people would ask me, well, how much can I earn? And I said, I'm just writing about a theoretical construct here, not an actually live, but it is wonderful to see companies like River publish their interest rate, convert it to an APR, talk about the number of fees, show their, as you mentioned, their channel balances going up and down, noting that when it's going down, it's not a bad thing. There's nothing bad happening. It's routine maintenance. Alex Leishman, the CEO of River, does a nice job of narrating that publicly. River is a sponsor of this channel. Rusty, just for your knowledge and for the audience as well. And we love being sponsored by River because they are engaged in the Lightning Network and in a way that they writing research reports on the Lightning Network and giving us interesting things to chew on. And we appreciate them for that. Rusty.
And I read those reports myself. So yeah. I'm a fan.
So shout out to Sam Wouters for those reports as well. Rusty, you said something that kind of broke my brain for a second. Lightning Network as potentially an interbank reserve settlement system itself, even though we think about the Bitcoin base layer as that interbank, which you just described, the base layer being the interbank settlement. But if Lightning Network nodes are moving money back and forth really quickly, that actually resembles how onshore US banks settle funds via the Federal Reserve System and their reserve balances, which are just accounting entries and don't have to technically use the wires or like the SWIFT system, for example, that a reserve settlement between banks is purely a Fed accounting entry. So, wow, can you get into that a little bit more? Is Lightning Network the reserve layer for the micropayment world? How did we think about this?
It's really interesting. This is something that had not really occurred to me because when we look at projects, for example, like Cashew and Fedimint, and these are classic like layer twos, right? Where you're basically providing IOUs. Now they have some great cryptographic properties. There are reasons you would do this, which are amazing. They're fungible. Even the mint itself cannot tell which one you're using. It provides this great layer of tokenization, which provides some definite utility. And convenience, and and everything else, and another acceleration layer on top. But the thing that what's interesting from my Lightning point of view is that these are using Lightning as the settlement layer between them. If you want to get one of these tokens in or out, you just send a Lightning invoice and it sends it over the Lightning network. So, in fact, just recently we had a request to be able to make a payment from multiple different points. Generally your wallet makes a payment. It may split into parts just for functional reasons in order to route it through the network, but it's a single atomic payment. And we had a request to say we want the API so that we can actually make a single payment from multiple sources, so that we can do these things where, I've got funds with 3 different custodians effectively, and I want to pay a little bit from here, a little bit from here, a little bit from here, kind of thing, because we're seeing it become this glue, this settlement layer for these services already. So it turns out when you build something, often people start using it in ways you hadn't anticipated, and this is definitely one of those. But on the settlement layer thing, so I don't know if you know this, but Joseph Poon had a sort of a traditional finance background, at least training, and his model for the Lightning Network and the way HTLCs work was sort of the T+1, T+2 kind of idea, where you do bond trading and you go, cool, well, I can cover that by trading for a slightly shorter bond, so we'll have a settlement layer. I'm talking out of my depth here, but this was his model for how HTLCs underneath the Lightning Network would work. Is that, hey, if I can guarantee settlement on the outgoing one for slightly shorter than the settlement I'm guaranteeing on the incoming one, we can make the system work. And so it's kind of coming full circle. If this ends up, supplying a layer for interbank settlement, that would be hilarious, because that was the model which engendered this idea in the first place.
Well, as a former bond trader, I have a huge smile on my face, because maybe it was predestined here the whole time that this bond trader would become a Lightning Network theorist and enthusiast. It's actually quite hilarious to me. Rusty, and just so people know, the gentleman Rusty is referring to, Joseph Poon, is the co-author of the Lightning Network paper itself. So Rusty, talk to us about now Lightning Network today. What are you building specifically? What are you working on? What are the challenges right now in Lightning, from your perspective or Blockstream perspective? And tell us about that.
Right. So we're at the phase now where it's all about quality of implementation, right? The Lightning Network basically works, and it's like, well, let's get better at it. Right. And that's very much an engineering kind of challenge to do that. One of the things, of course, that we're particularly concerned about, and Blockstream's mantra is very much like, we don't want to hold your money. Most of our products are on the idea of, if we can provide technical assistance or some kind of mechanical methods, software, whatever it is that ensures that you have full control, but you have some kind of assistance, for example. So the Green Wallet is a classic example. It's a wallet which degrades from a 2 of 2, so we co-sign every transaction with you, but after a certain period of time, it goes back to your sole control, right? And that was always the green model, so that we're not a custodian in any sense, but you get all the things that you would get from a custodian. You want your 2-factor authentication if you spend more than a certain amount, or those kind of things. We're in there, but we can never rug pull you. We can't take your funds, because you can just wait and they will degrade back to your sole control. So that's the kind of products that we really like to build. And on the Lightning Network side, it was a little bit more difficult. It's like, well, not everyone's going to run a node. Do we want them to be fully sovereign in the Lightning point of view? But there's infrastructure involved. There's complexity in this, and how do we do that? So we have effectively a hosting solution where you actually hold all the keys. We run the actual infrastructure in the Lightning node, but we can't do anything because you're holding all the cryptography. So you send in a request to us, it comes back to you to go, cool, sign off on this, please. Right? You're approving every single step, and not just from a policy point of view, but from a literal cryptographic point of view. We can't do anything, but it allows us to do a lot of the heavy lifting, and that's green light. So, these are the kind of products that we love building, because I think it does lift all the boats. And it takes advantage of the unique properties of Bitcoin, that you can have this service without trust kind of model, which is unusual, because in the real world, you tend to be, well, if someone's doing a full service thing, there's going to be that massive trust issue where you basically give them all your money and hope that they don't lose it. So that's our general direction at Blockstream, and it's certainly our direction in the Lightning team. So as well as working on the spec, the Lightning specification, which I was the original chair of the specification process, and now it rotates. But we're very active in making sure all the different implementations interoperate and various enhancements, usability enhancements there. But I also lead the core Lightning team at Blockstream, and we have a Lightning implementation, and that feeds into Greenlight and all those products as well. So I kind of have multiple hats that I'm juggling. I do feel there are some enhancements to Bitcoin itself that people are looking forward to and have looked forward to for a while. And Bitcoin being kind of this leaderless anarchy, or that's a little bit glib, really. I think the case you have to make for an upgrade to the base layer itself, rightfully, has to be incredibly strong. It has to be an incredibly convincing case to convince everyone to upgrade. Obviously in a backwards compatible way, what we would call a soft fork. But even so, the requirement for that is incredibly high. And there are some things in Lightning that we would like to do that would enhance usability and reduce this problem of what we call toxic waste, which is that you have previous states of where things have been with your peer, and you must never attempt to spend those, because the penalty for spending those is to lose all your money. So effectively, you've got this pile of like cryptographic toxic waste that you must never spend. And that has proven to be difficult just mechanically. That makes backups difficult. If you back up and restore, now you don't know, am I actually in the past? And I'm going to get penalized if I try to enforce what I think are my current rights, only to discover that actually I have given, I had signed away and said, I will never do this. There are some enhancements to Bitcoin itself that would remove that problem for us. And that's definitely the direction that I think we want to go. In the really long term, we look at fees increasing and that base layer cost increasing, as it inevitably will. And what does that mean for the Lightning Network? Does that mean that we detach somewhat from a layer, and below a certain amount, we are now or maybe not detached, but we're definitely in a different mode where the quality of the layer drops, right? There is now perhaps some trust involved to exit from that back into base money in a way that there isn't at the moment. I mean, just mechanically, if it costs you $100 to put a transaction on chain to enforce your rights, that's a much higher bar than it is today, where it's $2 or $3, right? And that's the future that there's a lot of people thinking very hard about. What trade-offs can we make there to try to keep that manageable? Because if your enforcement cost rises too high, then you've lost a lot of those properties that we love about Lightning, which is the fact that, you don't have, if you and I have a channel together and you try to screw me, it costs me $2, right? There's a ceiling there that I'm pretty comfortable with, right? And that it just creates a low trust environment where I can cool, if I open a channel with some rando on the internet, it's not too bad. If that enforcement cost starts to rise significantly, then, and it depends on other motivations, right? How much can you gain from that enforcement? Is it just going to waste both people's time? Well, sure, that's still an issue. But if there's a game you can potentially win and also cost me $100, that incentive game changes and we start to think harder. So there's definitely a huge area of research on building layer twos, whether Lightning based or otherwise, that work in an environment where potentially enforcement costs, that base layer cost, creeps up, and that for me is really interesting, and it involves almost certainly enhancements on the base layer money side, restoring perhaps some of the things that we had early on in Bitcoin, where we had a much more powerful scripting language, and for understandable reasons, it was hobbled in 0.3.1 by Satoshi. He kind of went, "Oh, we've actually we've created something too powerful here. And there was a CVE, which is um, a security disclosure on Bitcoin, one of the early ones in 2010, and Satoshi just disabled a whole heap of functionality in Bitcoin. Presumably thinking, look, well, you're in a crisis. I've been there. You, what's the simplest thing we can do? Let's disable it. But we never re-enabled some of it. And now we're starting to look back and go, wow, we really want some of that. Some of that power would potentially allow us to build more robust layer twos. So there's definitely a conversation being had at the moment on how do we get back there? What enhancements could we do that would let us bring the full potential of Bitcoin to modern layer twos?
So, Rusty, your answer to improving Lightning is actually a request for an improvement to the base layer, a soft fork to Bitcoin itself, not any specific Lightning. So, can you just tell us quickly what are the specific opcodes or proposals that you are behind right now at the moment and are trying to disseminate or research, test, all of that?
Yeah. So there is this. Okay. So if we look at a high level, the way Lightning works at the moment is, you and I are holding a transaction that spends some funds, and we've shared the transaction, but we've given each other signatures. So unilaterally, you can take my signature. Okay. Let's step back. We've put some funds in that requires, Nick and Rusty to both sign. Great. But you've already given me a pre-signature that just returns all the funds to me. Now we want to shuffle things, so I send to you. Go, cool. Well, now it's going to pay a little bit to you and a little bit to me. We've got the problem that what about the old signature, right? So we also hand over the secret and say, cool, I've given you the secret now. If I ever use that old signature and try to do the one that pays it all to me, you can use this secret that I've given you now to basically just take all the funds from me, right? And that's how enforcement works. That's how we can continue to swap signatures, not worrying about what happens if you use a really old one. So that's called the revocation secret. So you can do that, but that model builds up this toxic waste where you now have to be. We find that most frequently what happens is people accidentally use an old signature. So what we would really like is a fix-up system where if you use an old one, I just replace it with a new one. Right? We're just done that way. That requires a change to Bitcoin. There was a signature proposal called any preb out, where technically you can create a transaction that you can attach to any of the previous transactions. Go, cool. Well, I'm just going to update this here. Turns out though, there are multiple different ways that we could do this, and that's where we're really debating. So, what is the best way? Because other people have other things that they want to do, all of which are are interesting and valid. It's like, well, is there a way we can have our, is one of these fundamentally more powerful than the others? Are we better off just doing a single thing for Lightning, or should we open and say, look, let's go back and, build something more powerful that does many things? And it's a very technical debate. And, on my good days, I often side differently because, of course, it is unfortunately also a political thing. Like, what package can you present of improvements that is big enough to have all the improvements that you want, but compact enough that we can say, okay, I can review all that and I am happy with that as an improvement. And with different people having different things, people might be like, "Oh, no, it's got to have this thing that I really care about." And this is a normal kind of negotiation, but we're still in that phase, exploratory phase. People are still coming up with new layer twos that are completely different, that are really interesting. If only I had this, and then you've got to have an assessment, right? Is the thing that they require for that generically useful, or does it just enable this thing that's like a thought experiment and maybe not quite there yet? There's a lot of work going on these days, but I don't have a particular one I'm going to point at, and at this point I go, yes, that is definitely the one, because I think it's a fascinating process, and unfortunately we have to go through that process, right? I don't want to mess this up, obviously, and whatever things we add, our children are going to have to live with, right? We don't get to remove stuff because we don't break Bitcoin. We don't. Anything that's there today will be there tomorrow. So we really do have to go carefully. So even if it comes 5 years later than we would like, it's better than having buyer's regret afterwards.
Wise words, Rusty. Russell, we appreciate your time so much. We had your colleague, Andrew Polstra, on to talk about the soft fork process and why we shouldn't necessarily be scared of it so that Bitcoin can evolve. But the most important thing is that we don't break it. We appreciate you and your efforts and all the other devs out there that are working on Bitcoin tirelessly to keep it a protocol that the whole world can use. We are forever grateful. Rusty Russell, building Lightning at Blockstream. Thank you so much again for joining us. Please tell people where they can find your latest work.
So I'm Rusty _ Twit on Twitter, and all the normal places you would expect to find me, I'm there.
Great. Thanks. And we'll catch you guys next time.
Thank you, Nick.
Special thanks to River for sponsoring this channel. Purchase Bitcoin without any fees when you use River's DCA feature. River has become our trusted source of accessing the Bitcoin market because they don't use any third-party custodians. This is a very, very important thing to understand. River is not using another company to store the Bitcoin for them. They have their own multi-signature solutions, which means that they have designed their own way to make sure nobody else has responsibility for the Bitcoin for the time that you have River hold your Bitcoin for you on their platform once you have purchased it. So go check out river.com today. Thanks for sticking with us. As always, at the Bitcoin Layer, subscribe to our channel. Subscribe to our Substack at thebitcoinlayer.substack.com so that you can follow along our latest research and analysis.